Well, this is the second to last week of the course. And this chapter, the next two chapters, this one is about population, urbanization, and the environment. I wish they had reversed the order that those were in, because the environment is probably the very most important thing we could be talking about, maybe just in general, and certainly in this chapter. So I'm going to try and go real fast through the first part, which is very dense, and see if we can get to a population is very important too. Maybe it's the urbanization part I kind of did a short shrift on, but it's still long and complex. And then next week, the last week, we're working on social movements and collective behavior, which is so interesting to study and learn about at this time in America, around the world, but particularly what we're going through right now with various social movements and collective behavior and that type of thing. So, to begin this week's chapter, chapter 15, the questions we're going to be asking is, why do populations change? And they do. And here they're mostly talking about the changes in numbers in populations and the demographics of them. How many young people compared to old people in a population, for instance, that type of thing. So how do populations change? How and why is global and United States urbanization changing? And that's changing rather dramatically too, as you'll see. And then what are the consequences of those changes of urbanization, both in the US and globally? And then the last one are, what are the major environmental issues? And how can sustainable development be achieved? Right now, I'm going to say at this point, it can be achieved. It's not rocket science. As so many other people have said, if you can go to the moon, you can figure out sustainable development on the planet. The problem is here. In fact, most of the technology is already known. It's just that it doesn't make the kind of money that fossil fuels do and that type of things in a capitalistic society. So those trade-offs there have to be either extremely ethical people in charge of energy production, or there has to be some kind of trade-offs for them in order to shift. So that's what the issue is there. But yes, sustainable development can be achieved. So the big thing we're going to start with here is population. I looked up some more current figures for you. So some of the figures that I'm mentioning here will not jive with the ones in your text, because I worked, as I was writing the lecture, I checked certain statistics. So in 2014, the world population reached 7.2 billion. Now, I remember teaching for years about the future of a world of 7 billion. 7 billion was long considered before we reached 7 billion. That was maybe the breaking point. And maybe they were right. We don't, maybe those scientists were correct. And that was, people thought that long before demographers, there was such an awareness of climate change. Now we get the double whammy. So in 2014, we get 7.2 billion people. And we're all still here. Things are getting not so great, but we're struggling along. If you think we're struggling along, think about someone who lives in sub-Saharan Africa or Mozambique or somewhere like that, and what the struggle to survive is like there, and to have water and all that kind of thing, food. So now, currently, today, the world's population is 7.8 billion. It's expected to be at least 8 billion by 2024 and 9 billion by 2042. I'm putting something called a population clock up in the class where it's very disturbing when I look for it myself. You can just watch the world births, how many seconds, how many people are born as the clock moves through. You'll see when you go to it. So let's repeat that. Now the world population is 7.8 billion. That's currently, I think that was a 2020 figure. expected to be 8 billion by 2024, 9 billion by 2042. So how did this happen? How did we have this huge population explosion? You'll see when we get a little bit further on, the Malthusian theory points out that population increases not arithmetically, but geometrically. And I'll explain that more when we get to that point. But that's part of what happens. The more people there are, the more people there are going to be in the future, because people generally have more than 2 children. Around the world, just statistically, it's not true in industrialized nations today, currently, but that is historically the way it's been. Okay, so the population changes, it really changed rapidly after 1800. It's more than tripled since 1900. There's a graph in your textbook that shows that, and as I said, check the population clock in the coursework. So how do we know these things? Well, there are scientists, social scientists, who study just specifically these issues, and they are called demographers. It's a scientific study of human populations. What's a population? It's a group of people who share a geographic territory. So why do populations change? They do, we know that, but what are the forces behind that change? The first is there are 3, basically, 3 key factors. The first one is fertility, how many people are born. The second is mortality, how many people die. And then the third is migration, how do people move around. You can empty out one territory, area, country, etc., and increase it in another through migration. Okay. So there's also the world's 10 largest countries in your text. There's a chart there you should check out. So let's go to fertility. Fertility is obviously adding new people. It's the number of babies born in a specific time period in a particular society. And there are several different measures that are used. So the crude birth rate, the CBR, that's one of the most commonly used, but it's not very accurate. As we go on here, you'll understand why. And the crude birth rate is simply the number of live births per 1,000 people in a given population. And it's a very general measure because it's based on just the total population, people of all ages, from tiny babies to ancient people. Well, the tiny babies and the ancient people aren't having babies, right? So that's why the crude birth rate is an extremely general way of looking at things. It doesn't consider women's age, so the childbearing years, or their marital status, which used to be really, really important, but isn't as important anymore. So, but just for an example of the crude birth rate, in 2013, it was 20 worldwide. Today it's 17.873, almost 18, which is a decline of, like 1.5% since 2020. The birth rate is decreasing in all industrialized nations. We'll talk about that later too. In many, France is an example, Italy is another, it's below replacement level. You need 2.1 babies per couple to be at a replacement level. And 0.1 is because not all babies survive. Okay, we'll get into that more in a minute too. So what is a more accurate measure is what's called the total fertility rate, the TFR, which is the average number of children born to a woman during her lifetime. So now you're not looking at the whole population, you're looking just at women and how many babies are born during their lifetime. So in the early 1900s in the US, the number was 3.5, okay, was the average. Now, well, in 2018, I looked it up, it's 1.73. See how it is, and that is below replacement level, right? I just said you need 2.1. So obviously, in other countries, particularly non-developed or developing nations, the total fertility rate is much higher. And that they have an average of putting all of those together of 4 per woman. Now, in many developing and non-developed countries, that birth rate is much higher than 4. That's an average of all the developing nations. So here we go. To maintain the replacement rate for a woman and her partner, you need 2.1. Okay. So in the country, if the birth rate in a country is 2.1 or above, it means that the population in a country is growing and it's getting younger. Okay. But if it's below that, which it is, as I said, in all the industrialized nations, including the US, the population is it means that the population is decreasing. There aren't as many babies being born, and so the population in total is growing older. What's the problem with that? Well, older people don't work, right? The older they are. And that is a broad generalization. I'm being facetious there. But you understand what I mean. They're retired. Okay, in the US and all industrialized nations, there are supports for the elderly that are in our country's Social Security and Medicare. They're called other things in other countries, but they're retirement programs. How are they funded? They're funded through taxation. Who pays those taxes? Younger people. Each generation pays for the Social Security of the previous generation. So if there aren't enough young people to support the older people, there's going to be a crisis of some kind that will occur. That's the major issue with that problem. So with a low or below replacement level fertility rate. So next, let's look at now mortality, which is the second feature of how population grows or declines. So mortality, obviously, you're subtracting, not adding people through death, and it's the number of deaths in a given population during a specified period of time. And it's the commonly used one is the crude death rate. It's the same as the crude birth rate, the number of deaths per 1,000 people in a given population. So the current statistics, as I said, I looked them up. These are all between 2019 and 2021 stats. The crude death rate worldwide is 8.15. This is per 1,000 people, remember, and in a given period of time, usually it's a year, and 8.6 in the US. Another thing to remember is that the death rate doesn't measure a population's health. Because part of the reason that developing nations have a lower crude death rate is that we have more older people than developing nations, where their infant mortality rate is incredibly high and the average length of life is incredibly short compared to ours. You'll see as we move through this, it's like 54 or something like that in many of the developing nations, the average age of death from old age. So the death rate's not the best measure of population's health, as I just said. A better measure to look at, if you want to really understand more about a population's health, is the infant mortality rate. So that's the number of deaths per 1,000 babies born under a year old. The number of babies per 1,000 babies born that die under 1 year old. That's the infant mortality rate. If you go to 5 years, that's 5 years old, that's the child mortality rate. But the infant mortality rate is the one that is typically looked at to understand the health of a country's population. So because generally, as the standard of living improves, so does the infant mortality rate improve. So in the European Union countries, the infant mortality rate is three deaths per 1,000 born. In the US, it's not great, unfortunately. And that's so really, there's a couple of reasons. Certain Demographics have a powerful effect on infant mortality rates, race and ethnicity, not because inherently because of race and ethnicity, but because of poverty and lack of access to healthcare. So that is one of the reasons that our infant mortality rate is so high. And there's been much criticism about the technological types of birth that we do in the US. We just talked about that a bit in another lecture. And that also contributes. So our infant mortality rate is lower than all the other industrialized nations and lower than some non-industrialized nations. Iceland has the lowest infant mortality rate with 0.7, not even 1 per thousand births. Japan is very, very low. I think it's, it's just under 2, 1 point something. And then all the other Scandinavian nations have very low infant mortality rates. All, of course, as you know, those other countries have universal health care. And most in Scandinavia, England, and those births are conducted, 90% of them by midwives. Yes, in hospitals for the most part, in birthing centers, but not by OBGYN doctors. So there's a fraction of the technological interference with birth that when we have over a third of C-sections in the US, highest rate in the world. Okay, so lower infant mortality rate. Oh, and so in Angola, you know what the infant mortality rate is in Angola? It's 175.9. So let's just round it up 1 point. 176 babies die for every 1,000 born in 1 year. Okay, now go back to Iceland. Not even one baby, it's 0.7. Or Japan, under 2. Okay, so you can see the huge discrepancies in nutrition, healthcare, etc., from different countries. So lower infant mortality rate raises life expectancy, okay, when you're looking at big numbers, as demographers do. So what life expectancy is the average number of years that people who were born about the same time can expect to live. Why does the infant mortality rate predict life expectancy? Because, as we just said, the more babies that survive in a community, a country, whatever, the better the health care is. The higher, the more equal people are in terms of access to resources like clean water, good nutrition, health care, housing, all of those things which affect, infant mortality. Okay, so worldwide, average life expectancy is 72.81 years, almost 73 in 2021. That's combining males and females. That's the general life expectancy rate worldwide. In the US, it's now 77.8, so almost 78. It's declined recently due to COVID, but aside from COVID, it's been declining in the US for the last few years. There's a lot of scientific study about why that is happening. And we don't have time to go into it all now, but if you're interested, you can do some research on why the life expectancy is declining in the US pre-COVID, and then it escalated, of course, with COVID. So the US, the general total average is 77.8 years. Now, if you break it down into males and females, males 77 years, females 81 years. Now look at Canada. Once again, universal health care. Males 80. So in Canada, males' life expectancy is 3 years longer than the US. Females 84 in Canada, which is also 3 years longer than in the United States. Okay, so here's a key point. In every society, I think I've been kind of leading up to this, people with higher socioeconomic status live longer. That's just the way it is. you know, because of those things I mentioned. They live longer, healthier lives. They have safer occupations. Look at with COVID what's happening. Why do minorities in America have such a greater risk of dying from COVID, higher death rate? And I'm sure you've heard this because there's a big debate about who gets, vaccinations. A lot of it has to do with their jobs. Their jobs are often not safe, put them in danger to one degree or another. They have people in higher socioeconomic classes, so they have occupations that are physically safe, resources that include clean drinking water. And I put Flint in here to remind me to tell you, you know about Flint, Michigan, and the lead poisoning, the lead in the pipes. They're finally, after years, getting this resolved. A whole generation of children are born with horrible lead poisoning, which affects, learning ability and autism and all kinds of things. And it was in a black community, black area in Flint, and so nobody bothered, to fix it, even though there were exposés about it is fixed now. But those are examples of things of why, people die earlier that are in lower socioeconomic groups. Okay, so we've done fertility, mortality, and now we're going to look at migration. So migration obviously adds and subtracts people to populations. And so if you look at international migration, that number of international migrants reached an all-time high of 232 million in 2013. Now I looked it up, it's 281 million in 2020. So that's 50 million increase from 2013 from your text. And it's expected to double, which is truly incredible, by 2050. So it's at 281 million now, and that's expected to double by 2050. The largest numbers of migrants actually go from one developing country to another, like Indonesia to Saudi Arabia to work, or from developing countries to developed countries. So an example for that your text gives is Mexico to the US. So, but most migration is often moving to close or neighboring countries because that's a lot easier. You don't have to get on a plane or a boat, right? And that's an example, once again, migrants from Mexico migrate to the US, not to Canada, even though it might behoove them to be in Canada because of things like access to healthcare and a variety of other things. It's hard to get to Canada from Mexico, but crossing a border into the US, it's a neighboring country, so that's much simpler, easier, less strenuous and expensive and all of that. So we have 20% of the world's migrants in the United States, more than any other country, any other single or individual country. And interestingly, we're the only country where 25%, 1/4 of the migrants in the US are unauthorized. I think other countries tend to do a better job with their immigration system. So the most common reasons for migrations, for people migrating, are religious and political freedom, better schools, lower crime rates. War is a huge reason. That's and gangs, violence. That's what many of the Central American and Mexican folks coming to America, what they're trying to escape. Natural disasters is another one. And then, of course, economic opportunities is a powerful pull for migration into another country. So then what about internal migration, where that was country to country migration? Now we're going to look at internal migration, moving around within the country. Interestingly, over a 5-year period, 25% of U.S. adults moved within the country, and that's a similar rate to other industrialized nations. So in 1 year, 12% of the U.S. population moved to a different residence. That's not moving from area to area or territory, but just moved their house, their residence. Okay. Why did they do that? Almost 50% of them, it was housing related, job related, a variety of things. So, as you might imagine, as it does everything, social class, race, and ethnicity affect internal migration as well. So, if you look at the Puerto Rican migration from the island to the mainland, for example, it's often job related, family related. Also, they're moving from a area, the island of Puerto Rico, that has crumbling infrastructure and very poor schools and that type of thing. So those are reasons people move. Now, let's look at population composition and structure. And the first thing we're going to look at, and that's so important, is the sex ratio, the proportion of men to women in a population, women to men. So the sex ratio, here's how that is determined, okay? A sex ratio of 100 means that it's equal, men and women. A sex ratio of 95 means that there are 95 men for every 100 women. So worldwide, now think about it, this is so interesting. Worldwide, without any human intervention, there are about 102 to 107 baby boys born for every 100 girls. For example, the sex ratio in the US, the average is 105 boys at birth. Is 105 boys to 100 girls. Why is that? Well, male children have higher rates of infant mortality. They also have higher rates of fetal mortality, of what we call miscarriages. They're called technically spontaneous abortions. And part of that is because the changes that a male fetus has to go through to become male is much more complex. That females are, they're the default setting, and there's not that much chromosomal shifting and change that has to occur. So it is thought that that's part of the reason that there's more mortality with male, both fetuses and infants, than there are with female ones. So as I said, in the US, it's about 105 baby boys born to 100 girls. But by adulthood, that ratio is often reversed, 95. And the older you get, the more it's reversed, where there's, for instance, 100 females to 95 males by, certain ages. So in many countries, that sex ratio is much different. And there are many, 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 many more boys born than girls. They list some countries for you, 115 to 100 in Curacao, India 112. And that's due to, it's not that they're not actually born, it's that they're killed immediately, the females, like in female infanticide, also called gendercide. Also, once amniocentesis became available in India, for example, and ultrasound, the abortion rate skyrocketed, and they were all female children, fetuses, of course. And then in China, we know that imbalanced sex ratio has to do with the one-child policy, which also involved gendercide and abortion and that type of thing. So that is not a natural ratio, the 115 or 125 boys, but 102 to 107 generally worldwide is at the birth sex ratio between males and females. So there's graphs in your book of what are called population pyramids. You can also Google those and find them for any country that you're interested in, because they're all different, to see them and compare them. And there's several in your book, so you can look and compare them. And what that is, it's a graphic description, and some are bulgy in the middle that have a lot of people middle-aged, young adults and middle-aged. Some are bulgy at the bottom with huge amounts of children. Others are bulgy at the top. That's Japan. The US is getting that way, most industrialized nations, because the birth rate is so low. So where those bulges are in those population pyramids tells you where the majority of people are, and they're also split between male and female on one side and the other, so you can see that. So it's a graphic depiction of population's age and sex distribution at a given point in time. So if you look at Mexico's, for example, there's lots of a younger population under 45, which means there are many women of childbearing age. So the population is generally younger, and there are relatively fewer people over 65 in Mexico. But if you look at Italy, that's an old country. That doesn't mean the country's been around like that. It means that the population is older, as is the U.S. And the U.S. is kind of in between. It's not as extreme as Italy, but or Japan. Both of those have large population of the elderly people. But it's the scarcity of workers to support the elderly. That's the issue, as I mentioned earlier. So the next question or issue that your text brings up is population growth a ticking time bomb? I would say yes now, because it's reached this huge point. When it reaches a certain point, the escalation just keeps increasing, right? So that's the issue. Where's the end point? There doesn't seem to be any. The planet is finite. The resources on the planet are finite. So yes, it is a ticking time bomb in a sense. So here's the Malthusian. Thomas Malthus lived between 1766 and 1834. And what he said, he was the first person to really talk about this way. And that's why we're still talking about it, even though he was that long ago. He maintained that the population, even then, he died in 1834, that the population was growing at a faster rate than the food supply could grow to sustain it. Now, in 1834, that had a long way to go before that prediction became true. Now we're kind of in the process with, virtually 8 billion people here shortly to see, is that accurate or not? So what he said was, the population grows geometrically. It grows 2, 4, 8, etc. While the food supply grows at an arithmetic rate, 1, 2, 3, etc. Let's dig a little deeper into that. So you got 2 parents, right? And they have 4 children, okay? They could have 16 grandchildren. They could have a lot more than 16 grandchildren, but let's say they have 16 grandchildren, okay? So that's 2 parents starting out, and within 15 years, there's 4 children plus 16 grandchildren plus the original 2, okay, in a short period of time. Now, the available number of acres, that's where he said that's finite, right? There's only so many acres that are arable that can grow food on the earth. You only can reproduce farm animals so quickly. Farm animals, unlike many other animals, do not have litters generally. There's usually one, a foal, a calf, Goats sometimes have twins, but it's not that common. So you get the point. Farm animals, tend to grow arithmetically. So you got acres, arable land. They didn't mention this here, but you have water, which we're going to look at near the end of the chapter, available actual water that you can use to grow food. So those things can increase over time, acreage, farm animals, etc., but they can't quadruple in a short period of time, the way human populations can. So Malthus said that there were 2 kinds of checks on populations. How do you get out of this conundrum of this ever-increasing population? He said there's positive checks and preventative checks. The positive checks, and I know this is going to sound strange to you, is are famine, disease, war. By positive, what he means is they're not positive in and of themselves, but they have a positive influence of stopping population, famine, disease, war. The preventative checks are contraception, postponing marriage, abortion, limiting reproduction, et cetera, et cetera. If you reduce the birth rates through preventative checks, then it's a higher standard of living for everyone from a Malthusian perspective. Now, also, you eliminate some of those positive checks, famine, disease, and war. All of those often come because of overpopulation and scarce resources for the number of people there are. So neo-Malthusian, so you might think, well, what does somebody who died in 1830, whatever that was, 37, 34, have to do with me? There are social scientists and other people called neo-Malthusians, who, neo means new, who agree that the population is exploding beyond food supplies. I guess I would put myself in that category, since I said earlier, I think it's getting to an untenable number of humans for the resources that are available on the planet. So from a neo-Malthusian perspective, the result is if the Earth is, to use their quote, a dying planet, i.e. there is sufficient food and a population that increasingly pollutes the environment. It's estimated that 1 in 8 people around the world are chronically living with chronic hunger, and that's mostly children, mostly because there are a lot more children in those developing and poor countries than there are elderly people. In the U.S. we have a horrible what's called food insufficiency problem in the United States, which also affects the poorest among us, of course. So now we're going to look at the demographic transition theory. This is a different theory about population and the future. So the Malthusian, neo-Malthusian is one. The second one is the demographic transition theory, and that maintains that population growth is kept in check and stabilizes as countries experience economic and technological development. And this too is true. We can look at this and see. It's the industrialized nations in the world today that have the lowest birth rates and, or in some cases, as I've said, below replacement level birth rates. So stage one is that pre-industrial period. There isn't much population growth. At that point, the pre-industrial was going way back, or foragers and that sort of thing. There's a high birth rate, and also agricultural before pre-industrial. Very high birth rate. Some of those farm families had, 10 children, okay? But there was also a high death rate because it was antibiotics and good medical care and that type of thing. So stage one, pre-industrial, is a high birth rate, but also a high death rate. So the population remained fairly stable. Stage two is that early industrial phase. And there was lots of population growth during this time because the birth rate was higher than the death rate at that point. The birth rate can increase because of better health, a variety of other, better sanitation. The population still had large families, but the death rates declined for those same reasons. So they could have lots of children, but many more of the children survived, and people were living longer for the same reasons babies were living longer, which was that there was better sanitation, diet, access to healthcare. So early industrialization had lots of population growth, higher birth rates, longer lived, lower death rates. So most of the world's poorest countries are still in this stage. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, Yemen are in that stage. High birth rates, people living somewhat longer. Stage 3 is advanced industrialization. So as infant mortality rates decline, then you can have fewer children. The the genetic what am I trying to say? Impetus for having lots of children is that lots of them are going to die. So to wind up with 3 or 4 adult children, you might in the past had to have, and in some countries still today, have to have 7 or 8, right? So in an advanced industrial society, stage 3, the infant mortality rates decline, parents have fewer children, and because it's advanced industrial, there's effective birth control. Women are working outside of the home and, choose not to have so many children. So some examples of countries in that stage are Brazil and Mexico, and some Asian countries are in that stage. And then you get to our and Western nations type, which is a post-industrial society. We are post-industrial. We don't actually make widgets in factories that much anymore, which is what post-industrial makes. We're an information-based and technology-based society. And that is when the demographic transition is complete. You're back to what the foragers had, the very first stage, back to low birth rate and low death rates. And in that type of society that we live in post-industrial society, women are well educated. They have full-time jobs. There's not that, now in our country, that's not true. Little immigration. We have a fair amount of immigration, as you know. But if you look at, and the population starts to decrease, and we've talked about that. And so in the countries where the birth rate is very, very low, and in some cases below the replacement level, Canada, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, the US, and Europe, all the post-industrial nations. So what's the term zero population growth actually mean? It's a stable population level that occurs when each woman has no more than 2 children, except I have to amend your text and say it's got to be 2.1 to account for babies or children that may not survive. And some countries actually pay parents to have children today because of the low replacement level. Russia pays $12,500 for each additional child. Europe has amazing parental leave, and Italy also has stipends for people who have more children. The replacement level is very low. I mean, their birth rate is very low. So zero population growth just is the stable population level that keeps a population from growing. The birth rates and death rates are pretty much equivalent. Now we're going to move into urbanization, and I'd like to kind of whip through this so I can get to the environment and have time for that. So what urbanization is I'm sure you all know this, movement from rural to cities. And, it's always historically, until quite recently, been the majority of people live in rural areas, not in cities. But for the first time in 2008, in the history of the world, the majority of the world's population lived in urban areas, in cities. By 2050, it's going to be 65%. It interests me because in the 70s, the early 70s, there was something called the Back to the Land movement of all the countercultural people that you may think of as hippies, where the whole idea was to leave cities and go to rural areas and, be self-sufficient, grow your own food, etc. And that's what happened here in Coos County. It's really interesting. In the 70s, there was an influx of folks from, oh my gosh, all over the country, most of them from the West Coast, but not all of them, because this is a great place to be self-sufficient and survive a temperate climate, lots of water, et cetera, et cetera. So it was there was a brief moment in time, I'm just saying, and I think that may happen again with what's going on now, except that now land is so expensive, it's difficult obviously for people to do. So is another important thing to understand is that the growth of cities is a relatively recent phenomenon. About 7,000 years ago is when big kind of cities started. And by 1850, there were 56 cities in the world that had populations of 40,000 or more. So once it started rolling, it really picked up. And now there are megacities. This is a world urbanization trend. So there's megacities have to have at least 10 million inhabitants. In the 1950s, there was only 2 in the world, and they were both in, sorry, Tokyo and New York. But by 2030, there's 41 megacities in the world. That's people with a 10 million population, and only 2 of them are in the U.S. And those 2 are the New York, Newark area and the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Santa Ana area. And both of those, although they're mega cities with 10 million population or more, are much smaller than the mega cities in Tokyo, Delhi, Shanghai, and other Asian cities. So urbanization in the U.S., I'm sure you know this. First, we got suburbanization, the building of tract housing just outside of a city, right after the Second World War. That's when all of that began. Then edge cities, which are business centers that are close to suburban residential areas. They're either within them or close to them. Kind of an example of that on a mini level, because they're not business centers, so to speak, but on a micro level they are strip malls. Okay, exurbs. Exurbs are areas that are beyond the suburbs, that are a bit more rural, but they're on the fringe of the urbanized area. They're not completely rural. They're just the urban area, in other words, is slowly expanding out. So you have this mix between rural and urban called exurbs. And then a metropolitan statistical area is a central city of at least 50,000 people or more. So what are the consequences of urbanization? Well, I'm sure you're familiar with these: urban sprawl, traffic congestion. Urban sprawl is rapid, unplanned spread of development. And then it spreads out of the city and into regions adjoining the city. Eugene has very powerful rules about urban sprawl. It creates a lot of conflict in Eugene among people who want to keep moving, moving city limits further and further and further. Gentrification, that's when, people from upper social or wealthier people go into urban areas that are kind of run down and go, aren't these cute old houses if they were fixed up, and cute old storefronts. If you're from Portland, this has happened a lot in Portland, in the Mississippi area up there, which was the black part of Portland, in North Portland, and now it's a very chic, kind of hip place. Well, what happens is people the people who live there can't afford to live there anymore because rents escalate. That's called gentrification. And it results in residential segregation, but there's already residential segregation in most cities of one kind or another. Now we're at the environment, and we got about 10 minutes before my tape stops, or the flash drive won't hold any more stuff, whatever. So I wanted to read something to you quickly from this. Go to 304. Hold on, I'm almost there. Okay. This is the beginning of the chapter on the environment. Each year, Americans throw away 40% of their food, 50% more than in the 1970s. That ends up in landfills. Up to 3.5 million Americans get sick every year from polluted beach water that causes a wide range of diseases, including ear, nose, and throat infections, hepatitis, skin rashes, and respiratory illnesses. The United States uses 1.2 billion pounds of pesticides a year, but only 0.01% reaches the intended target. Now that's truly incredible. Truly incredible. The other 99.99% contaminates the food, air, and water. Okay, so there's some cheerful foods for you. So those types of problems, and there are so many more that we could mention, affect what's called the ecosystem. The ecosystem, I like the definition in your text because it uses the word community, a community of living and non-living organisms that share a physical environment. Is water a living organism? Not the way we define living organism. Yet it shares the environment, correct? Okay, and it is affected by things like I just mentioned. Okay, so water's the first subject we're looking at here in this last section on the environment. There are already limited water supplies, and now there's a greater world population, and extreme weather conditions and industrial pollution, it's jeopardized even more. In some developing countries, people spend up to 25% of their income to purchase water. So, and it's something that we pretty much just take for granted, right? So what about availability and consumption? I don't know if you knew this. It's important to understand this. Only 3% of the world's water is fresh water. The vast majority of water on Earth is in the oceans. Okay, so only 3% is fresh. 2/3 of it is locked up in the ground, in glaciers, ice caps, and, as I said, the oceans. That leaves about 1% for 7 billion people. Okay, so you got 3% that's fresh water, right? And 2/3 of it is either locked up somewhere in the ground, in the glaciers, and in ice caps. So that leaves 1% for 7 billion people. By 2050, there will be more than 40% of the global population will live in areas with severe water shortages. And this quote from the UN Commission is really an amazing quote to think about. Too often, where we need water, we find guns. I'm sure you've heard the term water wars. It's been mentioned a lot here in Oregon because California is desperate for Pacific Northwest water, and there's been a lot of hostility and discussion about all of that. That is also one of the reasons, aside from the fires, why so many Californians are moving to Oregon, to the Pacific Northwest, Oregon and Washington, is water, right? So the industrialized nations have much more access to water. As I said, it's not something we normally think about, right? And to clean water, and we pay much less for it, okay? Now listen to this. This is truly incredible. I'm sure you read this, but it blows my mind every time I see it. The average person in the US uses 163 gallons of water a day. In Germany, that's 40 gallons. In Denmark, 30 gallons. 23 in China, less than 3 in Mozambique. That's because they can't get it. And Americans, on the average, pay about 48 cents per gallon, and it's $1.65 in Denmark. That's also why Europeans use less gas. It's taxed to make you stop and think about, do I really need to go out today in a car, in a vehicle somewhere? You know, do I really need to leave the water running when I'm brushing my teeth? I'm sure you've heard about that, to turn off the water when you're brushing your teeth. You know, I don't think most of us ever thought about that. I certainly didn't growing up. Nobody mentioned the fact that there was could ever be a scarcity of water. In Northern California years ago during the drought, you know, it was because of flushing toilets, like there were signs everywhere in restaurants and anywhere there was a public toilet. If it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. You just didn't flush the toilet anymore, then you absolutely have to. Well, we don't think about those kind of things. But, unless you live in Texas during this nightmare, when suddenly there's no water, there's not only no water to flush your toilet, there's no water to drink, So I kind of was interested to hear so much of what was going on in Texas and what people's reactions were. And I remember a woman they were interviewing saying, I haven't had a bath in a week. Well, historically, you took a bath once a week, and it was the Saturday night bath because you went to church on Sunday. So, you can, well, anyway, don't get me started. There's so many ways, and I'm not saying that Texans in this situation had any options at all. I'm just saying that our standards are very different than they used to be in the country. And once again, I'm not saying everybody should only take a bath once a week or a shower, but you get my point. Our expectations are very different than what most human beings on the planet live with, okay? So the threats to water supplies, of course, the 1% that's available to all of us are pollution from spills and fracking. Most of the corporations, even if they get a fine, for the amount of fines they pay, it's just a slap on the hand. And then privatization is a huge factor of this. Look at all the bottled water that's around, and also some of the water companies have been privatized, and this is what happened, of course, with the energy companies in Texas. Was privatization. We're privatizing everything, prisons and that type of thing, but privatizing water, it's a huge business. So it transfers those assets to private corporations. And then waste, that's where I started this with talking about how much water we actually just waste. That's really something, well, so most of the problems are due to human mismanagement and waste, not nature. Now, we waste on a micro scale personally, when I talked about the water running into sinks when you're down the drains, when you're brushing your teeth. The big waste comes from agriculture, and also there are significant pipe bursts that 7 billion gallons a day are lost to old pipe systems that where it bursts. I'm going to run out of time, so I don't want to leave you with horrible depression about this or fear. There is so much that can be done on both a personal level with our habits. It's just habits that we need to stop and think about all kinds of things, okay? And also the big stuff is with policy, of course. And so your text wraps this up with reasons to be optimistic. So I want you to think about this. What has changed and how much worse it could be if we hadn't changed those things. And we will begin to change the things that need to be changed. So most cars don't use leaded gas anymore. CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, have been mostly phased out. All the spray cans we used to use, we were spraying CFCs into the air. The total emissions of 6 major pollutants have declined 54%. At the same time, our population increased 47%. And our recycling rate has grown dramatically. However, I checked it, it's down a couple of percentage points, and I don't know why that is. Some of the big companies have gone green, like Levi's, as green as they can. They're not 100% green, but they're at least making some changes. So Levi's have done that. Ford, Honda, Toyota are using recycled materials. Both Miller Brewing Company and Coca-Cola are practicing innovative water-saving devices. So yes, there are reasons to be optimistic. And as so often in so many ways, the worst thing it has to, you have to hit bottom sometimes, unfortunately, before the improvement begins. And I think we're kind of getting there, and that's going to happen. All right, that's it for today.